All right, welcome AP World History students. This is your 1.6 section over the European Middle Ages, medieval Europe, if you will. All right, here you see a map that shows you when we talk about medieval Europe, what we're essentially talking about. Most of the focus will be here in the Western area, um, following the Roman occupation there. All right, Dark Ages. Roman Empire was divided. And this meant that there's sort of a brain drain. You had the best and the brightest go east to the new capital of Constantinople, which meant that the West and this is after 476 AD, after the Roman Empire supposedly fell, but Rome, for intents and purposes, moved east and left Europe to its own devices. So you get this mix of old Roman and Germanic customs. The main thing you need to understand about the medieval ages is that they are very much under the thumb of the Roman Catholic Church. It is the most dominant, most powerful institution for roughly 1,000 years in Western Europe. Was it the end of civilization when Rome supposedly fell? Of course not. But trade was disrupted. Cities kind of fell apart. The population shifted eastward, as I said. You need to understand that medieval Europe was a rural society. There weren't very many cities, and these cities were very small, just, maybe 5,000-10,000 people for a while. And eventually you'd get London and Paris up into 20,000 or so. It took a long time for the population to boom in Western Europe. There was very much a decline in learning. Education levels went down, which meant that Europe fell behind other areas such as the Middle East and China. There was a loss of a common language. The common language under the Romans was Latin, but when Rome fell, people began turning to common vernaculars. And so people in the area we know as Germany began speaking German, and English people began using English, and French. And of course, that in itself is disunity. It's divided. Language divides people. If you have a common language, that's a unifier. In fact, the greatest unifier in medieval Europe is certainly the church. It's the one thing that they all have in common, that they are Roman Catholics by and large. All right, the Germanic kingdoms there were a lot of them. They were these small, shifting kingdoms. They had no true centralized government, so medieval Europe is very decentralized. And these Germanic kingdoms stressed loyalty to their family and tribe. Personal relationships. There's no way that they would fight for some foreign king or some distant emperor. They've had to break bread with you to have loyalty to you. Again, the church becomes the stabilizing factor in these chaotic times. Clovis was a famous French or Frankish here king, and what's important about Clovis is that he converted these Germanic peoples to Christianity. Now he did this to align himself with established power and bring a sense of unity to the region. So it made sense for him. Also, his wife was Christian, and she had a little bit of a role to play in that as well. All right, the expansion of Christianity is very much the story of medieval Europe. Around 600 CE, most Germanic tribes had converted to Christianity. Many times this was legit, and sometimes it was out of fear, because if you were anti-Christian, you could be persecuted in this time period. It brings that sense of unity to Western Europe. Monasteries pop up and become primary centers of education. Schools for privileged kids, of course, for the children of the nobles. They had small collections of books, but there's no printing press yet, so books are rare and expensive things. The Pope's authority expanded beyond the church, beyond the Catholic Church. He could actually raise armies. He can negotiate treaties with kings and his enemies. He could create laws. So he's very powerful. He's sort of like that distant emperor, if you will, often at odds with these kings, but he also sought to create new unified Western Europe. But there's a lot of politics that goes into these popes and their relationships with the European kings. Now, fast forward a few hundred years, the Holy Roman Empire in the 9th century, so the 800s, this combining the power of the medieval king Charlemagne, who's pictured to the right, and the Pope, Western Europeans saw the first real attempt at centralized control. Excuse me. You have to know that. Charlemagne, around the year 800, becomes emperor of the Franks. And you can see his empire here, which is modern day Spain, France, Germany. It's large. It's for Europe, it's the closest thing they're going to have to an empire. Um, but as you can see there, it never fully controlled Western Europe, never at all. It just wasn't really possible in that time period. Another major aspect of medieval life you have to know is how their social hierarchy worked. And we're going to talk about manorialism after this slide. It is a life of, this is important, cooperation and mutual obligations, meaning I owe you something and you owe me something. Here's the relationship. The king, he grants fiefs, which is land, and he owns peasants too. There's his lords and vassals. His lords are underneath him. They are vassals to him. That means they serve him. They owe him military aid when he calls for it. They owe him loyalty. He grants them land and peasants to work their fields to make them money. All right. Underneath the lords and vassals are knights. The lords provide knights with food. They provide them with shelter and protection, if you will. The knights provide them with military service and homage. All right, so the knights work for the lords, if you will. At the very bottom are peasants, and some of those are serfs, which would be even lower than peasants. They are giving food, they're given shelter, they are also given protection. They have to pay rent and they have to farm the land. That's how it works. That's the relationship. Peasants out on their own are easy pickings for people traveling by. In the bad days following the Roman Empire, they were often murdered and killed. So these knights who work for the lords provide them protection. For security, the peasants basically give them their labor. That's the relationship. Everybody owes somebody something in exchange for something else. This is not a great life, but they're relatively protected by the system, if you will. They don't have great lives by any means, but in the dark days, it was that or be picked off and killed, watch your children die. So they made a decision. So that's feudalism. That's the system of feudalism. Manorialism is a little more specific. It's the economic entity, a system of government and land owning based on specific rights and obligations. It's political, social, and economic system. The lord or noble was granted a fief, a parcel of land, by the king in return for loyalty. And of course, you have to pay taxes to the king. Knights were used to fight and protect. Serfs were actually peasants who could not lawfully or legally leave the place where they were born. Peasants could, they had some mobility, although they usually didn't do anything with it. They could move, but serfs legally could not leave their lands. However, they are not slaves, although the difference is extremely a fine line there. What they produce on the land belongs to the Lord because it is his land. They are working that land in exchange for the protection of the Lord and his knights. Here's a diagram of manorialism. You have the manor where the Lord lives. You have the pastures. All of this is his lands. There would be a church on his lands. Manor systems are self-sufficient. Everything that they need is made in the manor. All the food, you'd have workshops and blacksmiths fields. All of that stuff is going to support the Lord. So there's not very much traveling, and it really lends to decentralization. All right, they're basic, and ideas don't. This is important too. Ideas don't spread like this. These people they don't travel very far. Even the Lord sometimes doesn't travel very much, and so if these guys have great ideas, nobody ever learns about it. It stays here within their particular manner system. So you're become stagnant. And, there's no growth of ideas there. It was the basic economic system of the Middle Ages. Life wasn't easy. Again, the serfs had protection from outside peoples, but they had no protection against knights that were bullies. Sometimes the knights were bullies and thugs and bad people. And they had no protection from the nobles. Some of the bad nobles would sometimes, they would bed. If you were a peasant and you married, they would claim first night rights with the woman for you to be legally married. I mean, there were some bad lords and ladies out there. They had to pay taxes on food and marriage. They had to pay a tithe, a 10% tax to the church. So life was tough, backbreaking for peasants. Average lifespan of mid 30s. What was the role of women in Middle Ages Europe? They were considered inferior to men. That was the view of society in general and the church as well. This is patriarchal, pater meaning father. All right. Noble women could, however, inherit the estate from their husband if and only if there was no immediate male heir. The wife would actually be in charge of the manor when the Lord was away, perhaps when he was away at war or something like that. However, even noble women were limited, mostly stayed at home or lived in convents. Property was not handed down to daughters. There's always a few exceptions to this throughout history, but for the most part, women are going to wield power behind the scenes in Europe in this time period. As far as peasants go, life was based on raising their families and working the land. Men and women were equally responsible, but still male dominated. Daughters were not formally educated. Noble daughters could get an education, but that was not allowed for daughters of peasants. However, peasant sons weren't educated either. So, all right, the medieval European economy, combination of developments led to a trade revolution in the 11th century. By the 900s, you had new agricultural techniques, which is very important. More food equals more people. You had the moldboard plow, which was curved iron plate that can dig deeper into the earth, which keeps your seeds safer, and so you tended to have bigger harvest. You had a new horse collar, which wouldn't choke the horse, and so the horse was better to he could easily pull the plow. And then you had something known as the three-field system, which is an innovation. They would leave 1/3 of their land unplowed, which is called fallow, to regain fertility. Because when you plant in these fields, it sucks out the nutrients, and within a couple of years, you can't grow anything there. So they would do this rotation so that their fields would be fertile for longer. Political stability began to take hold in the 900s, in the 10th century, and population began to increase, which moves us towards towns and cities finally in medieval Europe. All right, expansion of trade. Why does that happen? The growth of cities led to specialization of manufacturing and artisanal techniques. That's artisans. All that means is that you had people who were cobblers, you had people who were blacksmiths and stuff like that, and weavers. You also had the growth of guilds, which were sort of like unions, a group of people in the same business or trade, such as stonemasons. Uh, if you were in the stonemasons guild and somebody asked you to build a house, you had to charge the approved rates by the guild. You had to have a certain standard of work, or the guild would kick you out. And so, guilds gave strength to skilled workers, these artisans, and that was probably their biggest thing that they did. All right, expansion of the banking system in this time period helped facilitate long distance trade. It also made loans and expanded monetary items. You also had changes in medieval government here in what's known as the later Middle Ages. Conflicts between nobles and kings led to compromises over political power. Kings were the head dogs, but in some places the nobles wielded great power. One of those places was England. You get a very important document in 1215 called the Magna Carta, which means Great Charter. King John of England agreed to sign the charter, which promised to limit his power over the nobles and church. It's important because that will lead us down a road to democracy, believe it or not. America will look at the Magna Carta when establishing democracy over here. There were no new taxes without the nobles' permission. The king just couldn't say, well, you know what, there's something I want, so I'm going to raise taxes on you nobles. Also, the king could not appoint bishops without the church permission. This was an end of something called investiture or lay investiture. So again, the Magna Carta is limiting the power of the king. Now, he signs this sort of at sword point, but he doesn't follow it real well. But it's a document that's written down, and it's a document that people are going to refer back to over the course of the next several hundred years. The governing bodies represented the interests of the nobles, the church, and the urban leaders. That's the three estates. Now, that's important. Later on, we're going to get a French Revolution. And so you need to know these three estates. The nobles are one estate, the church is an estate, and then the urban leaders, the rich people, the bankers, the lawyers, the doctors, the leaders of these cities and towns make up the third estate. Peasants are in there too, but they're represented by the other ones. English Parliament, which is kind of like Congress. The first one of those happens in 1265. Again, in England, we're starting to see elements of democracy. The Western European culture began to expand after the 11th century. You need to know the reasons. Population growth was one of those. You had better weather, so more food, and you had those agricultural innovations as well. There was religious fervor, so the idea is to spread the word of God. There was also increased trade. Italy and places like that are starting to pick up trade with the Middle East. Okay. Christians were reconquering Spain. They were booting out Muslims. Spain used to be Al-Andalus, controlled by Muslims, part of Dar al-Islam. But under Ferdinand and Isabella, who unite Spain, they're going to do something called the Reconquista, and they're going to push out Jews and Muslims, essentially anyone who's not Christian. It's also around the time that Vikings are doing a lot of settlements and establishments, some of them even in the New World in modern-day Canada, and this is a little bit before Columbus. But the biggest dramatic expansion effort by the West comes in the form of the Crusades. The Crusades were first called by Pope Urban II in 1095 for a complex set of reasons. Part of it was to get rid of all these knights that were causing problems, these unruly knights. And part of it was, the prestige he was hoping to bring the church. The first crusade was successful. You had French, you had English, you had German knights joining together to march on Jerusalem, the holy city, which was under Muslim control. And in the first crusade, Christians won it, which allowed their Christian pilgrims to make pilgrimages to the city where Jesus did all his work. And but unfortunately, for the Christians, the first crusade will be the only successful crusade. They will lose every crusade, and there's roughly 8 of them after that, and they'll lose the rest of them. In the third crusade, they lost to the excellent Muslim leader Saladin, and the Christian leader in that one was Richard the Lionhearted, King of England. Again, complex motives for the Crusades. Part of it was to reclaim the Holy Land, of course, and reunite Christendom, the East and West, which had been separated into the Orthodox Church in the East under Byzantine rule and the Holy Roman Church in the West. They also wanted to remove these undesirables, knights and other unruly people. They wanted to make money. The merchants made money off of loans, selling goods, and the prospect of opening new trade routes. And just in case you wasn't sure you wanted to go on something so dangerous, Pope Urban threw in this little extra thing. He told the people they were guaranteed a spot in heaven and all their sins forgiven if they died in battle. So it's a win-win. If you live, you get the spoils of war. If you die, an automatic place in heaven. So that was attractive to a lot of people. The Crusades have tremendous effects. You have to know. It's one of those things that's always covered on the AP exam. What were the effects of the Crusades? We talked about the causes right above this. Well, the effects is it expanded trade between Europe and Asia. It also weakened the power of the Pope because they were losses and increased the power of the kings from him. People were upset with the church after the Crusades because they were seen as unsuccessful, and really they were unsuccessful. It also created a legacy of intolerance between Christians and Muslims. To this day, right, we are dealing with issues between Christians and Muslims because of the Crusades. It also increased the persecution of Jews in Europe. That's important because we know eventually it's going to lead to the Holocaust, which happens in World War II. Women were able to gain a little bit from the Crusades because they were put in positions of authority because so many of the powerful menfolk were on the Crusades. So they had a chance to run the estates. In the 13th and 14th centuries, we're slowly beginning to leave the so-called Dark Ages. Rapid population growth caused problems because they happened very quickly. The agricultural techniques of the time couldn't keep up, and so that led to some starvation. And unfortunately for Europeans, the Black Death hits in the mid 1300s, and it kills off at least one third and maybe even more, maybe 50%, 60% of the entire European population. The numbers go as high as about 100 million people supposedly died. So really rough. However, there were some positives from the Black Death. Um, there was increase of peasant rights because it's supply and demand. When there were a lot of peasants, you didn't have any leverage. You were working the Lord's lands, and he could get rid of you if you didn't want to work. But when you're hard to come by, the only way the Lord can make money is if his peasants are working the land. So you start seeing wages and better working conditions and things like that. So it was actually good in the long term. I know it's crazy to think after all those dead people, but it broke up feudalism, which is very important. It broke up that system, got rid of it. You also saw the growth of professional armies, meaning that these people's jobs were soldiers. They weren't National Guard. They weren't farmers, and then they worked, on the weekend for the lords. Better weapon technologies strengthened the kings. You saw new emerging nations. There were slow developments of the arts and secular thinking. Secular means non-religious, something other than religion, which eventually paved the way for a movement called the Renaissance. The Renaissance was the rebirth of Greco-Roman ideals, and it brought new inventive thinking and new ways of art that we'll see a little bit in class when we go through it. All right, there's a lot there, but very, very important. It's going to be the foundation of a lot of the stuff that comes after here in world history. And if you take AP Euro, of course, we will go into more detail on this stuff. All right, thanks for listening, guys, and good luck. You're getting close to test time.